In the year 1174, a clerk named William Fitzstephen sat down to describe the city of London. He wrote about its cookshops along the Thames, where travelers arriving at any hour could buy ready-cooked meat and never go hungry. He described it as a kind of miracle. Hot food, available to anyone with a coin, day or night. What Fitzstephen did not describe, because no one in 1174 could have known to describe it, was what was living in that food. The parasites coiled in the undercooked pork, the bacteria blooming in meat held at uncertain temperatures over a dying fire, the rat droppings in the grain that made the bread served alongside it. Fitzstephen was celebrating a convenience that was, by any modern measure, a delivery system for a dozen lethal pathogens. And the remarkable thing is not that medieval London was dangerous. The remarkable thing is that Fitzstephen had no reason to think it was anything other than wonderful. That gap between what medieval people experienced and what was actually happening inside their bodies, their bread, their water, their air, is the subject of what follows. Not the dramatic dangers, not the wars, the sieges, the plague ships, the quiet ones, the ones built into breakfast. Start with water. Every town needed a well, and every town needed a latrine. And in medieval Europe, these two essentials were separated by a distance that would make a modern sanitation engineer resign on the spot. Archaeological excavations in York, London, Winchester, and Norwich have found cesspits dug within meters of wells. Not across the street, not down the block. Meters. The earth between them, packed, unlined, permeable, did nothing to filter the sewage seeping steadily toward the drinking supply. Excavations at Coppergate in York recovered eggs of intestinal parasites, Ascaris and Trichuris, from cesspit deposits so close to water sources that contamination was not a risk but a certainty. And here is what matters. There was no concept of waterborne disease. None. That understanding would not arrive for another 7 centuries, until John Snow traced a cholera outbreak to a London pump in 1854. A medieval person drawing water from a town, well that tasted fine, looked clear, smelled acceptable, had no way of knowing that the bloody flux, the dysentery that chroniclers recorded as endemic in every town of any size, was coming from the same hole in the ground where they fetched their morning drink. Your sewage and your water were separated by a few feet of dirt that filtered nothing, and you drank from it every day because you had no reason not to. Now consider the bread. Rye was the grain of the poor across northern Europe, France, Germany, Scandinavia, England's colder counties. Wheat was expensive. Rye grew where wheat would not, and rye carried a passenger. Claviceps purpurea, a fungus that infected the grain and replaced individual kernels with dark, elongated growths called sclerotia. These sclerotia contained alkaloids chemically related to lysergic acid, related, in other words, to LSD, along with potent vasoconstrictors that shut down blood flow to the extremities. The result, when you ground the infected grain into flour and baked it into bread and ate it, was a condition called ergotism. The convulsive form brought seizures, hallucinations, psychosis. The gangrenous form brought a burning sensation in your fingers and toes. They called it ignis sacer, holy fire, saint. Anthony's fire, followed by the blackening and death of the tissue, followed by the loss of the digits themselves. Your fingers fell off, from bread. The Annales Zantenses record a major outbreak in the Rhine Valley in 857. A French epidemic in the Limousin in 944 reportedly killed tens of thousands, though precise numbers from that century are unreliable. What is reliable is the mechanism. Rye bread, staple of the poor, intermittently laced with a fungal toxin that could fracture your mind or rot your hands. And there was no way to tell a clean loaf from a poisoned one by looking, smelling, or tasting. The most basic human act, breaking bread, concealed a betrayal that no one could detect until the burning started. If the bread did not kill you, the air in your own home might. The central hearth with no chimney was standard in most European dwellings until the 12th or 13th century, and in peasant housing considerably later. Christopher Dyer's research on English rural homes confirms that through the 14th and 15th centuries, many still used open hearths with nothing more than a smoke hole in the thatch, a hole that was frequently inadequate, especially in rain or wind, when it was covered. What accumulated inside was not the clean heat of a modern fireplace. It was a thick, visible layer of smoke from peat, green wood, or increasingly, in English towns, coal. That smoke hung at head height. It filled the room where people slept, and it contained carbon monoxide. The skeletal evidence is unambiguous. Charlotte Roberts and Margaret Cox, analyzing medieval remains from English sites, found chronic sinusitis, respiratory disease markers, and soot deposits in lung tissue. The signatures of years spent breathing combustion products in enclosed spaces. By 1285, the problem was bad enough that King Edward I established a commission in London to investigate the health effects of coal smoke, one of the earliest environmental health inquiries on record. The air had become, in the language of the petition, so corrupted that it was injurious to health. A modern person sleeping in a medieval peasant cottage with the shutters closed against the cold and a peat fire banked for the night would be breathing the same gas that kills people in sealed garages. There was no detector, no alarm, no chimney, just the warmth you needed to survive the night, slowly filling your lungs with poison while you slept. Step outside and the hazards shift, but do not lessen. Ernest Sabine, working through London's court records in the 1930s, documented a city whose streets were open sewers in all but name. Human waste dumped from upper-story windows. Animal dung from horses, cattle, and pigs accumulating in unpaved lanes. Kitchen waste, butchery offal, and standing water mixing into a central channel that ran down the middle of every street. Town rakers, paid officials whose job was to clear the worst of it, were chronically underfunded and hopelessly overwhelmed. Regulations existed. Fines were levied. The waste kept coming. If you had shoes, you had some protection. Many did not. Shoes were a luxury for the rural poor and the urban underclass. Walking barefoot through streets where hookworm larvae waited in contaminated soil was not a dramatic event. It was Tuesday. Ankylostoma duodenale, the human hookworm, penetrates the skin of bare feet, migrates through the bloodstream, and colonizes the intestine. Piers Mitchell's archaeological parasitology studies confirm its presence in medieval European contexts, and hookworm was the subtle killer. The immediate one was simpler, a cut on the foot, contaminated with the Clostridium titanibacterium present in animal dung, progressing to lockjaw and convulsions within days. Coroners' rolls from English counties record deaths matching the clinical profile of tetanus after minor wounds. A scratch on your heel from a stone in a street where a horse had stood that morning. That was enough. Pause here. Consider what the list has already established. Your water is contaminated. Your bread may be poisoned. Your air is toxic. Your street is an infection vector. And you have not yet eaten a meal, visited a doctor, or gone to bed. If you are wondering whether medieval people knew any of this, the answer is they knew something was wrong, and they were trying. This is the part that popular imagination gets exactly backward. Medieval towns were not indifferent to filth. They regulated it. They hired people to clean it. They fined violators. The medical school at Salerno produced a widely circulated health manual, the Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum, advising people to rise early, wash their hands, eat moderately, and avoid night air. The problem was not stupidity. The problem was paradigm. Humoral theory, the dominant medical framework for 1,000 years, was internally coherent, intellectually sophisticated, and wrong about nearly every mechanism that mattered. They could not fix what they could not see. Which brings us to the barber surgeon. When you fell ill from the water or the bread or the smoke or the cut on your foot, and you sought help, you entered what was arguably the most dangerous room in any medieval town. Galenic medicine prescribed bloodletting for virtually every condition. Fever, headache, melancholy, pleurisy. The lancet came out. The barber surgeon opened a vein, caught the blood in a brass bowl, and moved to the next patient. The lancet was not sterilized between uses. The concept of surgical asepsis did not exist. Guy de Chauliac, whose surgical manual was one of the most widely referenced in the 14th century, recommended cleaning instruments by wiping them with cloth or rinsing them in wine. It was not enough. The patient who came in with a headache might leave carrying whatever blood-borne infection the previous patient had deposited on the blade. If you want to know what a trained physician actually prescribed, consider John of Gaddesden, physician to King Edward II, whose Rosa Anglica was one of the most widely used English medical texts of the early 14th century. For wounds with putrefaction, Gaddesden recommended a poultice of fresh cow dung mixed with egg white, bound tightly to the wound. Cow dung, on an open wound. The dung introduced Clostridium tetani and Clostridium perfringens, the bacterium that causes gas gangrene, directly into broken skin. The treatment was more dangerous than the injury. The act of seeking help was itself a cause of death. Let me tell you what waited when you came home and lay down. Your bed, if you were among the majority of the medieval population, was a straw-filled pallet. A rough linen sack stuffed with wheat straw set on a low wooden frame or directly on the earthen floor. Household records from wealthier homes recommend changing straw seasonally. For the poor, it was changed rarely. And inside that straw lived an ecosystem. Fleas, lice, bedbugs. The body louse, Pediculus humanus corporis, nested in clothing and bedding and fed on human blood, and its feces carried Rickettsia prowazekii, epidemic typhus. The infection entered through scratched skin. You scratched because the lice bit. The lice bit because they lived in your bed. Typhus, untreated, kills between 10 and 40% of those infected. Your bed was not rest. It was a habitat for the organisms that would give you a fever from which you might never recover. Now imagine you have survived the water, the bread, the smoke, the street, the doctor, and the bed, and you want nothing more than a drink with friends at the tavern. The tavern is dark, low-ceilinged, lit by a single rushlight or tallow candle. The ale is cloudy, unfiltered, served in a shared vessel, a leather blackjack or a ceramic jug, passed hand to hand around the table. One man is coughing. He wipes his mouth and passes the cup. Charlotte Roberts and Jane Boekstra's bioarchaeological studies document skeletal evidence of tuberculosis across medieval European populations at high prevalence. TB is transmitted by respiratory droplets. The mycobacterium survives on surfaces and in liquids. The combination of communal drinking vessels, crowded spaces with no ventilation, and endemic tuberculosis in the population made a single tavern visit a plausible transmission event. It would not kill you in a week. It would set a death sentence in motion from a single evening of ordinary fellowship. And the cup itself was working against you. Pewter, tin alloyed with lead, was the standard drinking vessel of the medieval middle class. The lead content varied by quality and maker, but cheap tavernware sat at the high end. Acidic liquids, ale, wine, anything with bite, leached lead from the vessel into every sip. Tony Waldron's analysis of medieval London skeletons found lead levels consistent with chronic poisoning. Not dramatic, not sudden, but a steady degradation of kidney function, immune response, and cognitive capacity that made every other threat on this list more lethal. The pewter cup did not kill you outright. It made you easier to kill. There is one more. The grain you stored for tomorrow's bread sat in a corner of the same room where you slept, because you were not a lord with a purpose-built granary raised on staddlestones to keep the rats out. You were a peasant whose sacks of rye sat on the floor. And the rats came. They gnawed through the hemp fabric. They urinated on the grain. They left their droppings mixed with the kernels you would grind in the morning. Rodent urine carries leptospira, which causes liver and kidney failure. Rodent feces carries salmonella. The bread you would eat tomorrow had been in intimate contact with waste products carrying pathogens that could shut your organs down. The rat was not an invader. It was a permanent resident of your household, and it had been eating your food and contaminating your future meals every night for your entire life. In 1184, King Henry VI convened a royal diet at the Petersburg Citadel in Erfurt. The assembled nobility of the Holy Roman Empire crowded into the Great Hall to settle a dispute between the Archbishop of Mainz and the Landgrave of Thuringia. The wooden floor, bearing more weight than it was built for, collapsed. Dozens of nobles plunged through the splintering planks into the latrine cesspit below the hall. Multiple independent chronicles record that several drowned, not in a river, not in battle, but in sewage. The most powerful men in the room died in the most degrading substance imaginable, because the infrastructure of even a royal fortress was built over a pit of human waste. That image earns its place not because it was typical, but because it was the concentrated truth of everything else. The latrine, the cesspit, the waste that medieval infrastructure could not separate from medieval life. It was always there, underneath the floor, beside the well, in the street, on the bread, in the bed. Every hazard on this list shares a common architecture, the gap between what people could see and what was actually happening. They could not see the bacteria in the water, the alkaloids in the rye, the carbon monoxide in the smoke, the parasites in the pork, the lead dissolving into the ale, the louse feces entering the scratched skin, the mycobacterium on the shared cup. They could see the symptoms, the flux, the burning limbs, the headaches, the lockjaw, the fever. And they built a sophisticated, intellectually rigorous medical system to explain those symptoms. And the system was wrong. If you have ever walked through a medieval cathedral and felt the stones still holding warmth from the afternoon sun, you have stood inside the achievement of people who carried roundworms in their gut. Piers Mitchell's archaeological evidence shows that virtually every medieval European was host to intestinal parasites. Roundworm, whipworm. Their eggs appear in nearly every cesspit excavated from the period. Not some people, not the poor, nearly everyone. Universal parasitic infection was the baseline condition of human existence in medieval Europe. Every figure in a medieval painting, every king and bishop and merchant's wife and child, carried organisms feeding inside them that they could not feel until the burden became heavy enough to cause symptoms. And yet, they built, they legislated, they studied Aristotle in universities that still operate. They raised cathedrals whose engineering still exceeds what most modern builders attempt. They composed the Divine Comedy and the Canterbury Tales and the polyphonic music that still echoes in the churches where it was first performed. They did all of this while drinking contaminated water, breathing toxic air, eating bread that might poison them, sleeping in beds alive with disease vectors, and carrying parasites that had colonized their bodies from childhood. The question the title asks, would you survive a week, has an honest answer. Probably, yes. 1 week of exposure to any single hazard on this list would be unlikely to kill a healthy modern adult. But that is not what the medieval poor faced. They faced all of them, simultaneously, from birth, with no understanding of the mechanisms and no tools to intervene. The hazards did not take turns. They compounded. The lead weakened your immune system. The parasites stole your nutrition. The malnutrition made you vulnerable to the tuberculosis you caught at the tavern. The smoke damaged the lungs that needed to fight the infection. The barber's lancet introduced new pathogens into a body already struggling. It was not a week that killed you. It was every week, layered on every week before it, in a world where the things keeping you alive, the water, the bread, the fire, the bed, the healer, were the same things wearing you down. The next time you run a glass of water from a tap, consider that you are performing an act whose safety was engineered by centuries of death. Every water treatment standard, every building ventilation code, every food safety regulation exists because someone at some point died from its absence. Medieval Europe did not lack intelligence, ambition, or care. It lacked the germ theory of disease, the chemistry of toxicology, the epidemiology of transmission. What it had instead was 1,000 years of people trying to live inside systems that were killing them in ways they could not perceive, and building, out of that darkness, out of that invisible siege, a civilization whose cathedrals and laws and languages outlasted every organism that fed on its founders. Tell me in the comments, which of these would have gotten you first? I think most of us would not have made it past the bread. And if you want to understand what the medieval world actually was, not the Hollywood version, not the theme park version, but the documented, excavated, archived reality of how 1,000 years of human beings ate, slept, healed, and died, this channel goes to the record every time. Subscribe, and we will keep going back.